welcome back to another edition of the Global Policy Next Generation Book Club, in which we talk about policy relevant issues in books. Last time we did Angrynomics and had a really interesting conversation about the different ways that political economy affects regular people. We were revealed to not all be political economists, but thankfully we have one on staff who guided us through our conversation. Today we're looking at another area of strength, right, from one of our editorial staff. And we're going to discuss The Global Governed by Doctors Kate Pincock, Evan Easton Calabria, and Alexander Betts. These are three researchers who are at the University of Oxford at the Refugee Studies Center, and they have written a very interesting book that looks at when and where do refugees become significant organizational providers of social protection. Social protection, according to them, right, is activities that are designed to reduce population's poverty, vulnerability, or risk. I went in thinking it was going to be physical protection, and shockingly, that is not what they're talking about. They use a comparison of four major refugee sites in East Africa, Kampala and Nakivale in Uganda, and Nairobi and Kakuma in Kenya. This is a really deep ethnographic dive. It's very different from Angrynomics and in some of the ways there. But these four sites provide insights into the effects of national strategies, right? We're looking at Kenya versus Uganda. We're looking at different ethnic and political backgrounds, and we're looking at really different site characteristics, comparing kind of this urban immersion versus a very formal refugee camp atmosphere, which is what I think many of us think of who don't work on refugees day in and day out. They point out, right, that there's a real tension between local individuals on the ground, right, who are in these camps, and international assistance groups in the refugee space, basically, and suggest that refugee community organizations are the link between these two communities. Right? But there's a real chicken and egg problem, right, of needing capacity to receive international recognition, which comes with it the funding and support, but you need the recognition to build capacity. So like, how do we solve this problem? It's about 160 pages, but it's a really thick description book of a lot of really interesting detail and a lot of interesting field work. I should say at the outset that I got to watch this book evolve in some ways. I know two of the authors, and it was very interesting to read the finished product because it challenged my own lens of what refugees are, right? Of that refugees are a problem to be solved rather than a self-sufficient asset who should be empowered. So that I think was very helpful, and I am excited to hear about everybody else's perspectives on this book. What'd you think?
Well, coming from more of the field of migration and refugee studies, I will start us off and say that as you were describing, Kate, I think the strength of the book is its empirical ethnographic material and this thick description and this recognition that refugees are living both in camp contexts and in urban contexts, and that this produces different situations and obstacles that they have to deal with. That being said, coming from more of this academic field of study, I found the book's sort of central claim, what they're saying is refugee-led organizations exist and they deserve recognition, is not a particularly radical claim to me. I think that refugees themselves have been saying this for a long time. And that is one of my quibbles with the book is that I don't think it takes three white authors from the University of Oxford to tell us that. And in that way, I think that the book misses a major opportunity and almost falls into the trap of something it's critiquing, saying that we should be listening more to refugees, and yet it doesn't include a refugee or a local as a co-author. And I think that in that way, it's almost falling into its own trap. But that being said, it does present really rich, interesting empirical material that I think provides an interesting context for discussion and debate around these issues.
Some points. I'm being outside of this field of study. I have heard a lot and seen a lot of colleagues working on it. So I was really impressed by the amount of material, by the amount of interviews, by the amount of ground that the study has covered. It has also taught us something about global governance in a way, flipping out the lens of the global governance, which I appreciate having done my PhD in global governance, because we do look at the states, we look at who does the provision, as they say, UNHCR, all of those agencies, and this is what I've read. but also a few of the things that we started reading in my field and where this book really contributes to that discussion. Well, there's people at the bottom that are doing the same lift work, and we're not often recognizing them. And I think this is important contribution for me. It reminds me about a work of a dear colleague of mine who did her PhD at the same year as me. So we finished at the same time, and she looked at the refugee journeys. So she had those stories, she traveled with them, she saw that. And I think those are important contributions, important stories to be told. And I'm really happy to see that book trying to tell some of the stories from those camps, from the RCOs, which are understudied, underthought, especially by those in the power. So I think it really provides interesting dynamics that are really important to consider. And even me not being in the field, I was like, oh, this is great. This is something that I would like to learn more. So that was excellent the way it was done.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Janina, in that I think this book is an interesting link in kind of this chain of larger conversations about fieldwork and how we in the global North engage with the global South in a way that is ethical and sort of a rising tide model of that we need to be inclusive and lift all ships, so to speak. And the sort of these larger questions about researcher positionality, about how research is not something that happens to other people, right? And I think it's an interesting piece, right? It's an interesting start of a conversation there. But I agree with Anastasia in terms of the not being part of the field, right? And coming in and being like, wow, my mind is blown by all of these things that I did not know because I'm not part of this field. What really struck me in terms of a contribution beyond the things that you've already highlighted is, as I said before, challenging this idea that assistance is something that just sort of happens to refugees, right? Which is foolish once I take a step back. And of course, people have agency and are going to seek to improve their situation and collectively organize. Like, of course, they're going to do that. Human beings do that. But to me, what a lot of resonance was that this, again, coming from a conflict space, right? Coming from a security space, that there are a lot of connections with the challenges of demobilizing insurgent conflict actors, right? And how we're doing sort of the same, the international community is making a lot of the same mistakes in a lot of different contexts, right? About assistance programs providing skills and trainings that don't match the interests and abilities of those communities, but are coming in with biases or with kind of preconceived notions about who these people are, and so are offering these very path-dependent options, right? A bit like, oh, well, you're a refugee, so that means you don't have an education, you have a low set of skills, so you should have, you want to be a seamstress, you want to be a barista, you want to be something that isn't necessarily what we would call white collar, right? Which is completely inaccurate. And shockingly, people are not going to necessarily buy into those paths in the same way, right? Like that's not, I wouldn't. So why would I expect someone who's in Nairobi to do so, right? So anyway, I thought that was a particularly an interesting thing that I could rant about for a while. I want to bring our conversation towards a conversation thread, right? That we started to get into before we started recording. But I brought up, right, that this is a timely moment in politics for this conversation because the Biden administration has recently announced that they will keep the lowered refugee cap for resettlement in the United States, which brings up these bigger questions about if refugee camps are intended to be temporary and that until refugees can be either resettled in new home states or in theory returned, but I don't think that we're doing that so much anymore. Janina, help me out here. Increasingly, though, we're seeing sort of this retrenchment, right? This move away from a global perspective and more to a protectionist space. So states are failing to agree to this burden of refugees, despite the fact that we know that refugees are great for the economy, right? That they integrate really well, that it's actually a net positive, but the political optics of it are problematic. So how might the recognition and incorporation of agency into refugee policy change the international community's approach? Is it going to change it, or is it just people are terrible and so nothing is going to change it?
Well, I'll say in terms of what you've just evoked, Kate, there are three solutions that UNHCR recognizes for refugees. One is, of course, resettlement to a third country. One is potentially return. And unfortunately, we are seeing that happening. For example, Denmark has just announced that they will allow Syrians to be returned, even though many in the international community do not think that Syria is a safe country to return to. And of course, the third option is local integration. And that's what de facto we're seeing happen in these two contexts that are described in the book. These are protracted refugee situations. These aren't people who have arrived in the past weeks or even in the past months. And they've really, even if there are still legal obstacles, de facto, they're integrating into these local communities and economies. And we see them expressing their own agency, even when that doesn't go recognized. And so I think it is important to sort of give the international community and national governments a nudge in terms of saying, well, this is something that we have to be more attentive to from a governance perspective, because people are expressing their own needs and engaging in these communities in different ways. And that's part of this chicken and egg phrase, which I don't know how many times it came up in the book. And I don't entirely agree with that framing of the problem, because I think that's taking a very international organization's view of what capacity is. And I think that goes to what you were saying, Kate, in terms of these sort of skills trainings that we think need to be offered to refugees as a sort of skill-less population, sort of thinking of them as a capacity-less population. Well, no, these are people who have capacities, and maybe they don't fit the dominant model of what we want NGOs and humanitarian organizations to do. But I think it's important to recognize the capacities that people already have and that they're exercising despite the institutional obstacles to that. And I think that, in fact, that's something that the book does pay attention to, is that they highlight that there are some organizations that do manage to be successful because they have this sort of charismatic leader figure. And I think that's a narrative that we really have to challenge, because as the book says, that shouldn't be necessary in order for people to exercise their right to assembly, to participation. You shouldn't have to be exceptional in order to do that, but there are institutional obstacles in place and systemic problems that prevent people who are put in these precarious positions from engaging in that way. And I think that's another interesting sort of thread that the book follows through on, is it says protection is very much a form of power. It's not a neutral, benevolent category. It becomes a form of governmentality. And in that way, it engages with the literature that already exists in both the development and the humanitarian spheres about how these become a form of governmentality and they disempower populations. And I think that the book makes some important efforts to challenge those narratives.
Those are really interesting points. I'm going to go in a bit of different direction answering this question. And given that the book provides a bit of political economy, so I'll go beyond the agenda, I'll go to the state receptions, because states have, different political agendas, different political economies, different capacities, different capabilities. So some states are inherently differently structured, and we saw it, right? We saw the two examples in the book where the states have different rules, different, different set of way of accepting people, not accepting people, accommodating, not accommodating. And yes, agency is important. When we see agency, probably states might be more willing to, accept and help the refugees integrate. But at the other time, we have to think about the local populations, where they're coming from. Some local populations are more accepting of refugees. They're more supportive. They are more willing to, help out, to help them integrate into the community. And so just looking at some of the stories that, going back to the colleague of mine that has been, traveling with those refugees, seeing how they integrate, there's different stories in different countries. And so acknowledging the different political economies is very important, even before we look at the agency spectrum. So there is going to be obviously a range across countries, and no matter how we position the refugees as being there, being capable to do something, some countries are more or less better at getting combining the two and creating a miracle sometimes, and others might not be as capable.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but it strikes me that the countries that I would expect to be good at it, right, oftentimes aren't. And the country and valuing refugees are better at it, right? And so I get really stuck, right, on like, what do we do about this? How do we, I know what I want to do, but from the policy perspective of like, how can you make this a top-down problem, or is this really a bottom-up problem? And I like that this book really focuses on kind of, tries to do both things, but gives me a perspective on kind of the bottom-up piece that I didn't have before. I mean, is part of this refusal to recognize refugees as agents, right? As people and organizations that are in fact providing services to their community and doing it effectively, part of a gendered lens. I mean, I really like, again, coming from outside the field, it seems like the language that we use in media and in a lot of, like, again, in the United States and the global North, talks about refugees as kind of this model of women and children, right? Of that they're fleeing conflict and they're vulnerable. And if that's the case, then, our pre-existing sort of gendered perspectives are that they are the recipients of aid, right? They're something that we then go in and save. The princess is not saving herself in this context, right? And if we recognize refugee agency, does that then upend kind of our ideas of who is a refugee, what they're capable of, and what they are accepted to? Or have I just been reading too much gender literature this week?
I think for me that in terms of vulnerability, there is certainly a gendered component to it. And I think that's something that's helpful to do as a reflex, as a way of sort of centering people and their agency, is to think of vulnerability not as something that is inherent to people, but to think of it as situational. So people are in vulnerable situations, but they in and of themselves are not vulnerable. But to me, the sort of disempowering narratives come less from gender. And to me, it's much more a colonial question, in that look at the parts of the world that people are coming from, and think about the histories of those places, and then think about why Europe and North America doesn't want people coming from those places. And to me, there's a very clear colonial link there. And there's a lot of decolonial thinking, I think, that needs to happen, and that is happening very much in the space around migration and refugee literature, in terms of saying who has the right to move where and who is moving where and due to what circumstances. Because when we look at a lot of the situations that are producing movements of people, a lot of them can be traced to colonial histories and ongoing neo-colonial relationships.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was thinking about this in the context of COVID, right? And that we have seen in again, my background, right? My is the United States, and so that's the news that I'm most following. But there's been this huge move, right, of people returning to moving out of the cities, of moving into different communities, in a way that, like, as I was reading this book, that we would talk about them as IDPs, right? If this was happening in Africa, we are talking about them as IDPs when it's happening in Africa, or as refugees, but we don't. It's not the language that we use, right, in the global North, even though these are people that are moving because of external pressures, right, and to be safer and to be to protect their families, to support their families, all of these other things, like, and that's A, I think, a function of space, and B, a function of colonialism. But this sort of the Westphalian model, right, of that as soon as you cross a border, now you're a refugee because you've moved in with auntie, right, or what have you, doesn't necessarily hold up in all contexts, right? That becomes really problematic really fast.
No, but I think you're talking about one perspective. It brings me my thoughts about psychology. There is this thing that they refer to schemas. So basically the pictures that we would imagine when we recall a certain word for a certain thing. So when you think, for example, if I say ocean, right, you would imagine yourself, relaxing on the beach. For somebody else, ocean, or for a refugee, right, you would think about crossing the ocean for a better place, right? So those inherent schemas that are inbuilt in us, the books we read, the things we do, right, that shapes our view mind. And if you're grown with a particular book's thinkers saying things that this is how they should be, appearing in your mind, right? Refugee, you would think, as they said, women and children needing protection, right? sometimes when we see the news, it's actually, those are capable people, sometimes coming with a lot of skills, a lot of, as you said, a lot of baggage that can contribute to the community. And the agency is very important. And I think more books like this that are uncovering our hidden, presumptions and schemas are helpful to change the policymaker's mind and, shape the receptiveness towards those kinds of migratory flows. And you said global North Sea movements, right? Different names, different, right? Those are schemas, right, that we are using. So I think it's important to look at our own biases, expose them, and think about them from a deeper perspective. So I agree with a lot of statements that you have just made. So just an agreement, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, right? And like, how do we change those schema? Like maybe this idea of highlighting and working through, refugee-led community organizations, right, is a way to challenge that, right? If everybody knows about the UN, I mean, you might not know about UNHCR or all of sort of the internal divisions, but like there's this idea that the UN goes in and saves people, right? And maybe if we change our narratives a little bit about it's not external actors saving people, it's the communities themselves figuring out ways to overcome challenges, right? That starts to align a lot more with like the quote unquote American dream, right? Versus sort of this Janina's, point about paternalistic colonialism, right? So that then challenges a whole lot of things that makes people uncomfortable. We're overthrowing the system today, guys. It's a good day.
Yes.
I have a lot of things that I would really love to talk about, but I'm sensitive to our sort of time and how much we're asking of our panelists. So I would like to close out with policy lessons, right, that we took away from this book. How, if we are global policy, what do we do about this then? Do we strong arm international organizations to work through, refugee community organizations? Do we do a lot more direct funding? Like, what do we do about this? What did you take away from this as the next steps, the concrete steps?
Well, that was something that I appreciated in the book, is that in the conclusion, they do identify 4 very concrete policy recommendations that they have as a takeaway. And one is simply mapping and recognizing that these organizations exist. And I think that's an important first step, because of course we know these organizations exist, but maybe the governments and international organizations need to be better at recognizing that. They have the point on capacity building. They also talk about direct funding, and they talk about partnerships. And I think, to me, the policy lesson comes back to asking hard questions about what really are the priorities of national governments and of the international organizations. And are they really there because they have these people's best interests in mind, or are there other factors certainly influencing? And are they willing to overcome those factors to listen to the people who they are meant to be in partnership with, and the people whose rights they are meant to uphold? And so I think we have to start by asking those difficult questions. And if we're willing to face the difficult answers to those questions, then maybe we can genuinely open a dialogue and be speaking to the people who are directly concerned and not just about them.
I agree with you, Janina. I think one thing that stood out for me the most is the manual that I've written, and they're in place in those organizations, and the mapping, upsetting those manuals. So when we have a manual, it's easy to go and say, oh, we don't have it written on the paper. What do we do? So the institutional path dependency of everything. And it happens in global governance. We need this kind of crisis to go and kick us out and, try to reconsider the ideas, right? And so I think this book is kind of that kick in the door, right? It tells us, hey, there's more things happening. You need to map them. You need to understand them, because when we have this manual, we're unlikely to look beyond and say, oh, well, there is this. How do we deal with it, right? And we see a lot of times that from this book, there is not enough of engagement, not enough of those given agency down, the top-down model that is there, has been based in the manuals, that has been incorporated by policymakers in place at a particular point when they did not have this knowledge. So once we have that knowledge, once we are more aware about the situation on the ground, I think that's going to be very helpful to, especially with the mapping exercise, to understand how we can then better serve the population, how we're able to better serve the refugee groups in a particular countries, in a particular locations. And I think, you know, the biggest saying, I think I always wrote it in my papers in undergrad, is one size does not fit all. And I think this is something very important to carry out through that. We saw it with the book, with different camps operating different cultural groups operating different things. So I think as a policymaker, we need to be more aware to the local circumstances and also upsetting our own beliefs, trying to understand what's on the ground. So I really think that this is the strength of the book, and this is something that I'll carry with me as I go forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually ties us back around to Janina's first point about, you know, does this really need to be 3 researchers from Oxford telling us about how it is on the ground? And to some extent, no, but to some extent, yes, because these are the, you know, the governments and the international organizations that are getting in there and doing stuff, right, are being drawn from these communities, and they're doing it without a map. Right. And so you can't work with people that you don't know are there. Right. And so you end up empowering people who have charismatic leaders or great English language skills, or figured out Twitter. Right. Like all of a sudden, like, oh, well, we should definitely give money to these people or assistance to these people because I can reach them. Right. And whereas if we commit to something that feels like a very like, oh, of course we should do this. Mapping and recognition efforts, right? All of a sudden, oh, well, maybe actually the best partner in this situation is not the person that USAID has always worked with, right? Or not the organization, which has a lot of implications, right? Within the refugee communities themselves and with power. And so like that, I fully recognize that that is not a value neutral policy statement to disrupt kind of existing structures and partnerships and what have you. But I mean, some of the things that I took away from this book in terms of the policy lessons is just really basic stuff that we know, but we don't know, right? Of that, like, it's going to take longer and it's going to cost more money than any domestic voting population wants. But that's how you get long lasting, durable solutions. And that you don't have to act upon these populations, right? That the population is working to make their lives better. Of course, they're human beings. Like that's the basic sort of nature, right, of every human being, is that they're going to try to make sure that they have an okay life and that their kids have a better life and that their communities are protected, right? That's like hindbrain schema of how we should exist. But that, you know, we need to be a little bit more critical, I guess, in our approach. And that there's a huge place for this kind of research. I mean, that's what I really took away from this, is that, at least in political science, we have gone away from thick description, ethnographic embedding, engaging with research subjects, you know, deeply and in lots of contexts, because it's expensive and it's hard and it's all sorts of things. And, you know, we prioritize other things, but gosh, they give us really, really good and important perspectives when they do it, right? And they let us have much more nuanced conversations beyond, should we accept more refugees into Nebraska or not? So I obviously come to this with a bias. I'm excited that we got the opportunity to read it and talk about it. And I appreciate you guys coming along for the ride.
Thank you for choosing the book, Kate. I think it was such an excellent segue to different discourses for me. I love the way how it made me think critically about everything that I know. So thank you for choosing the book, and it has been a pleasure reading it and reviewing it and talking to you guys about it. I think you, as having 2 experts on the field, you know, it has been excellent learning for me for this experience. Yeah.